For over 100 years, battles have raged in the air for command of the skies.
If you don't have air supremacy, you're in trouble.
Since its earliest beginnings in World War I, the airplane is the supreme weapon of the armed forces.
This was a real battle for civilization, for humanity.
It revolutionized battle and changed the ways war was fought and won.
The F-117 has obviously changed how we design aircraft and air campaigns.
War drove innovation in the skies.
What we hear from the Air Force is when the F-35 wasn't there, all others died. When F-35 was there, they reigned supreme.
Aircraft bred a new kind of hero. The fate of entire nations depended on the bravery of a handful of men.
An appreciation of the extent to which young men were willing to put their lives on the line for an ideal is something we need to remember more often than we do.
In this episode, helicopters take the fight to where no other plane can go.
I can land a helicopter in a 50-foot opening in the tree canopy.
You're talking about jungle terrain, mountainous terrain, and so you needed helicopters to perform all that work.
From the South Atlantic seas.
Effectively, the Falklands was its baptism of fire.
To the urban wastelands of Somalia.
We flew a 10th Mountain Black Hawk over the city every night looking for bad guys.
The helicopter reigns supreme.
And when the enemy hears the Apache's 30mm, things tend to get quiet quickly. So it is a warfighting machine, and it is there for the soldiers.
In dangerous terrain, the Huey took soldiers out of harm's way.
You know, it was something that saved their lives in many ways.
When it takes to the air, the helicopter becomes the cavalry.
It's now the Skyhorse that's taking us in. It's the Huey or the Black Hawk. It's another whole dimension for land warfare for the Army.
When the helicopter flies, the opposition runs for cover.
I think in just about every wartime situation, the helicopter has proved its worth 1,000,000 times over.
Helicopters are essential to the modern battlefield, providing vital air cover for ground forces and infantry, and identifying and eliminating enemy targets. To achieve total victory, a ground war needs to be fought. Any battle needs boots on the ground. Only a helicopter can get combat troops in quickly and with a high degree of precision. Enter the Sikorsky Black Hawk. The Black Hawk is a multiple-role utility aircraft. With its two powerful turboshaft engines, it's capable of lifting up to 9 tons of cargo, the equivalent of 2 armored Humvees. And it can carry up to 11 fully armed combat troops.
I've ridden with as many as 14 people in there. The most critical asset on any battlefield are the amount of helicopters, because everybody wants them, because you have to get from point A to point B, and a lot of times people don't want to drive over the roads because roads have mines and IEDs.
It's been the workforce, the backbone for not only the U.S. Army, but also the Navy, the Air Force.
The Black Hawk has the capability of operating in almost every combat theater.
I've operated in every environment that you can imagine the Black Hawk works in the jungle, in the desert, in the Arctic, urban. You know, probably one of the most dangerous areas is in the urban environment. The most critical part of that is the insertion. And most of the time when we are coming in by air is by the Black Hawk.
If we cannot land, then we can actually throw ropes on the side and actually have rappelling and also fast rope on the sides of the aircraft.
Troops rapidly descend from the Black Hawk using the fast roping technique to abseil to the ground in seconds.
You grasp the rope and you slide down it just like a fireman's pole.
But one slip could be fatal.
The longer the rope, the hotter your hands get. And the more weight you have on your back, the hotter your hands get. So some guys literally go out with welding gloves. I never like to put on thicker leather gloves because it kind of loses the sensation. If you're fast roping on top of a 40-story building at night, it's pretty hairy. Even though you know the pilots are the best and the rope's right in the center of the helipad on top of this building, but all you see all around you is a fall of, 300 feet if you go off the edge.
Rick Kaiser was an American Navy SEAL in 1993. He was operating in Mogadishu, Somalia.
One of the missions that I did do while I was there was called Eyes Over Mogadishu. We flew a 10th Mountain Black Hawk over the city every night looking for bad guys with weapons, and when they started shooting at us, we shot at them. That's what you do in war.
The Black Hawk has a reputation for being tough.
The helicopter itself can take a hell of a lot of punishment. It can get you in and out of there after sustaining a hell of a lot of damage. And I've seen it, and I've been part of it. The thing keeps flying. It's amazing. This helicopter has been shot down 3 separate times. They put some new engine in it, it comes right back into battle.
As a troop carrier, it often flies unarmed, so it must take precautions to avoid enemy contact.
Navy SEALs operate at night. That's what our job is. The only time that we would go in during the day is for like a hostage rescue operation where lives are at stake. A helicopter is a big target, especially for machine guns, RPGs, whatever. And at night, that gives us the advantage because they can't see us. When we plan a mission, it's at night. We try to get it with no moon, because then you don't have any light or reflection at all. As you can see from the helicopter behind me, it's a very flat black green color. So at night with no moon, it's virtually invisible.
But in daylight, the Black Hawk has little defense.
The Black Hawk flying in daylight is probably about as vulnerable as any other helicopter. If the helicopter is flying too low and too slow, it becomes vulnerable to ground fire.
The Black Hawk was used to combat rebel forces in East Africa. Somalian militia were using food as a weapon to starve the country's population. It was genocide, and together with the UN, American forces took on the militia. The conflict that unfolded resounded around the world. It became known as the Battle of Mogadishu.
The main mission was obviously to stop the warlords from stealing the food, which causes the famine, which caused all the death of the Somali people. And our job was to take out the key individuals that were making this happen.
US intelligence located 2 key lieutenants who commanded the Somalian rebel forces.
They felt the best way of grabbing those 2 guys were to insert troops quickly by helicopter, seize them on the ground, and then take them out, all within 60 minutes. And that was considered reason enough to mount a daytime operation.
Flying the Black Hawk helicopters in were pilots from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment.
Pilots such as America's elite force are second to none in either day or night operations, particularly night operations. They are known as the Night Stalkers.
A task force of 19 aircraft, 12 ground vehicles, and 160 soldiers were dispatched. But the rebel forces were ready for them.
They decided that that was the day they were going to fight.
On October the 3rd, Black Hawk helicopters were inserting troops into the city, flying in a daytime mission that famously turned into the Battle of Mogadishu.
On that day, we were going in to take those guys out, and while this was going on, they shot down one of the helicopters, one of the Black Hawks. And once that happened, it slowed our 15-minute raid into a 24-hour nightmare.
During the operation, 2 US Black Hawk helicopters were shot down by rocket-propelled grenades, and 3 others were damaged. American troops at the crash sites were isolated. An urban battle raged throughout the night.
We were there the whole time in the midst of the city, you know, downtown, fighting to keep our comrades alive to get out of there.
Early next morning, on October the 4th, a combined task force was sent to rescue the trapped soldiers.
Some of the things that were happening we didn't even know, like when we saw truckloads of Somalis being shipped in to fight from outside the city, we didn't know that was happening until we watched the video afterwards, and then we were just like, oh yeah, no wonder we were having such a hard time here, because they were just trucking in hundreds of fighters. If people tell you they're not scared, they're lying to you.
Even though they were isolated in the streets of Mogadishu and facing overwhelming odds against the militia, defeat was not an option.
Did I ever think this could go south? No, because we were too busy just trying to stay alive and complete our mission. So that was the only focus that I had for the 24 hours that we were fighting in the city.
The battle resulted in 18 deaths of American soldiers, with 73 wounded, and one helicopter pilot, Michael Durant, captured. Estimates put over 1,000 Somalian militiamen killed. October the 4th, 1993 was the bloodiest day involving US troops since the Vietnam War. It began the moment a Black Hawk was downed by the rebel militia.
The reason that I believe that the Black Hawk was shot down in Mogadishu wasn't because the Black Hawk has a flaw or they're easy to shoot down. It's just that they're big and they're slow, and when you're flying in the daytime, which we never should be doing, they're easy targets.
But the Black Hawk's reputation remains intact.
For me as a Navy SEAL, yes, it is the best combat helicopter I've flown in, because that's my experience.
A world away in Afghanistan, America launched Operation Enduring Freedom in response to the 9/11 attack on New York's World Trade Center. America led a coalition of over 40 countries, including Britain, France, and Germany, to combat Afghanistan's extreme Islamic rulers, the Taliban. Once again, helicopters were an essential part of the American-led coalition forces.
Helicopters have played a huge role in Afghanistan, enhanced in importance by the fact that the infrastructure is terrible and the roads are heavily mined and ambush prone.
In the front line was the iconic American Chinook troop carrier.
Most of the time we're flying at night, so usually we're waking up and the sun's low in the sky, and by the time we're getting out to the aircraft it's pitch black, and we'd go take off and do whatever it is that they needed us to do that day. So often that's flying out to a remote area to drop off a lot of soldiers.
The Chinook is able to carry troops to almost any location in the world.
You can get 30 troops with one helicopter to almost any altitude, and it's usually what is requested by the ground force.
The Chinook can also lift up to 8 tons of cargo. It's able to operate in conditions that limit other helicopters. The high altitudes and low temperatures of Afghanistan are no obstacle for the Chinook. And with significant upgrades, it just keeps on getting better.
Essentially looks the same on the outside. The engines look a bit different, but the body of the aircraft looks almost identical. But it is a very different aircraft today than it was originally.
The new airframe has a non-metallic composite body. The Chinook also has state-of-the-art navigation systems. It's quicker too. Powered by 2 turboshaft engines, delivering almost 5,000 horsepower. It has a top speed of nearly 200 miles an hour.
It's got 2 big engines, 5 transmissions, 2 huge rotors. It's the fastest helicopter in the Army inventory. That thing would cruise at 160 to 180 knots, and that's moving right along. And both of the rotors would be like this, but as you go faster, they actually tilt forward on them.
It's not uncommon for us to have to slow down for the other helicopters that are escorting us to try to keep up with us. It's quite smooth, so really there's lots of those moments where you've done all the planning and you've done all the preparation, and now you've taken off and you're in the middle of the mission, and You kind of look around and just sort of enjoy the moment.
The Chinook was introduced in the 1960s, just as a new conflict was brewing in Southeast Asia. It ushered in a new era of aerial warfare, dominated by the helicopter, the Vietnam War. The conflict pitted communist North Vietnamese forces, the Viet Cong and the NVA, against the South Vietnamese and America.
Right from the beginning, both sides were supported by the superpowers. It became this sort of almost archetypal proxy war that slowly drew in more and more direct participation from particularly the United States, but also in a smaller capacity China and the Soviet Union.
It was a new type of warfare, jungle guerrilla warfare, where enemy troops were fast-moving, conduct hit-and-run tactics, sabotage, and ambush larger and less mobile forces.
In Vietnam, you had hot, humid conditions, jungle terrain, and an enemy who were every bit as fierce as the North Koreans were.
And Vietnam's jungle terrain was almost impenetrable, making troop movements by plane or land vehicles impossible. It was time to bring in the cavalry.
Now we've got helicopters that'll let us take the place of the horse. That's why we still call it the first cav. But instead of riding a horse, and that's what the emblem, it's used the first cav, it's still got the horse and all that kind of stuff on them. It's now the sky horse that's taking us in. It's another whole dimension for land warfare for the Army.
The US Army deployed the 1st Cavalry Division in Vietnam. In true cavalry style, the Chinook was often sent in to rescue the infantry.
One of my jobs was to shut down fire bases. So you'd take a fire base and you'd Huey out most of the personnel for that, would bring in a Chinook, run the Jeep inside, then either pick up the ammunition and or the artillery pieces with the hook.
Helicopters were known for deploying troops into landing zones, known as LZs.
That kind of mobility really increased the reach and power of the military, and Chinook was integral to that. It was part of the Vietnam War, and being able to put 30 soldiers into an LZ or take them out again allows you to take maybe 2 Chinooks and do what you were previously doing with a lot more Hueys or some other type of helicopter.
As well as troop and cargo carrier, the Chinook was adapted as an assault aircraft.
I remember Guns A Go-Go at one point, they had 50 cals in the doors. And then when the helicopter did a high bank turn where they're shooting at the ground, they actually shot off the tips of the rotors. Oh yeah, I mean, you got a rotor that's down here and you're shooting through it. Next thing you know, you're just shooting through the tips of the... Not a good idea. It doesn't mean you're gonna crash, but if you damage some blades and, you know, all of a sudden you get some bad vertical vibrations. No, let's don't do that one anymore. So yeah, we limit the upward limit on the M60s and teach the guys how not to do that.
Crews of the Chinook found other ways of attacking the Viet Cong.
I could drop napalm and I can drop tear gas, depending on what we needed. You put that in a big cargo net with one of the corners of the net tied back inside so you're not throwing the net away. And we could carry, 8 or 10 55-gallon drums of napalm or tear gas. And the crew chief, when you let it go, would throw a white phosphorus grenade with it, which would ignite it. So he'd throw the Willie Pete out when you'd let it go. And then I'd usually do a high bank and see if the machine gunners could ignite it first.
The US Cavalry Division also introduced the iconic Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopter to the conflict in Vietnam, famously known as the Huey.
They'd recently taken delivery of very large numbers of these sort of ubiquitous UH-1 Hueys, And the idea was that in such a sort of vast, mostly jungle and mountainous in some cases as well, so very impassable country with very poor roads and infrastructure, by using helicopters en masse, US forces could be inserted for sort of strategic targeted operations each day where they needed to be, or brought in quickly to trouble spots.
Well, the Huey was really the aircraft that enabled us to do what we call the vertical envelopment. It was the next generation of cavalry-type units, tactics. Instead of arriving by horse, we could actually come in vertically and bring in a platoon or a company or even a battalion if you needed to. The Huey, for the first time, would lift 8 troops, combat loaded, bring them in, fly them down, just do a real quick landing on the skids.
One of the problems was that they had to defend themselves against the Viet Cong, who would hide around the edges of a clearing and open fire when the helicopters landed, and indeed when they were taking off.
We would just do a combat insertion, a combat assault into a landing zone that was either natural or cut with chainsaws or blown down with a 5,000-pound daisy cutter bomb that just blew everything down. Then you've got enough area to bring in 18, 20, however many aircraft you've got available with, 8 people on board each one. So you'd land a whole bunch, drop them off, just come in sequence as you had to.
The Huey was an instant hit with both pilots and crew alike.
My first tour in Vietnam, I was with the infantry. And I had a friend of mine who was on a fire base and they got overrun. So he had a number of people killed and he needed to borrow some radios from me. So this was up in Hue Phu Bai back in '68. And so he asked if he could borrow some radios and I decided to bring them out to him at Firebase Brick. Huey takes off and we're flying up the river, up the Parfume River. It's a meandering river. And I wasn't paying much attention to it, but all of a sudden I looked out and I'm looking up at the treetops. And this guy is flying up the river, yanking and banking along these turns. And so this is like being in a sports car or motorcycle on a curvy road. This is cool. And so I get up between the pilot and the co-pilot and I'm watching, and that's what he's doing. He's just flying the curve and then flying the curve. This is cool, I like this. All of a sudden he's coming up to this one curve that is way, it's like a 90 degree and he's going way too fast to do a 90 degree. We intuitively know that. And he didn't take it. He just did a cyclic climb and flew out. That was the departure point to go out to Firebase Brick. I said, that's so cool. And so I applied shortly thereafter. I said, I've got to apply for flight training. So I applied while I was over in Vietnam and got the pass. But that's how the Huey kind of got me into flying again. And this is cool.
The Vietnam War demanded a new style of combat to attack the North Vietnamese. The guerrilla warfare tactics employed by the Viet Cong and the MVA was new to American forces. They were mobile and they used the thick jungle terrain for cover. To attack the North Vietnamese, a new tactic designed for helicopters was created by the Americans: hunter-killer packs.
The idea of hunter-killer packs came about because of needing to find where the Viet Cong were and needing to attack them on their home ground, if you like. And so having got hold of the concept that you could arm these helicopters and using the Loach as a scout and indeed a light attack helicopter in its own right, the idea was that you could go in, you could hunt for the enemy, and then you could use the attack helicopters to actually destroy the enemy.
The helicopters worked in teams. The armed Huey was the killer. The Hunter was the scout helicopter, or Loach, a low-altitude attack helicopter.
The OH-6, it's a bumblebee. I mean, this thing is, up, down, left, right, absolutely beautifully maneuverable. I love that aircraft. I mean, it's just a hand. It was the best scout I've ever flown, and I think any scout pilot would agree with that.
The Hughes 086 is a small, nimble scout helicopter with a top speed of over 140 miles per hour.
The design was beautiful. This is a little pregnant Easter egg, we'd call it. You know, it's just an Easter egg shell with a tail boom coming out. It was a bumblebee. I could go up, down, left, right, backwards. The thing would just do what you wanted it to.
While the attack helicopter flew higher at around 1,500 feet, the Scout would fly low, seeking out enemy troops.
They'd throw smoke at them, they'd throw rocks at them, they'd shoot at them and stuff like that. And if they got return fire, they'd break off, drop smoke, and call hot 1 o'clock or something like that.
Then the attack helicopter would drop to engage.
Once they shot back, oh crap, you know, it's here I am. And then you got 2 Cobras rolling in on you. You know, it's death and destruction. And not only did we have just the folding fin with the explosive heads, we also had what they call nails, flechettes. We'd have like 1,500 finishing nails with little fins on them, with split tips on them. Just nail them right to the tree. Just really some deadly stuff.
The new tactic of using the Loach helicopter to draw out Viet Cong ground forces, allowing the attack helicopter to strike, proved very effective.
It was very successful in terms of trying to maintain the borders and keep the Viet Cong at bay. It was only that the sheer numbers of Viet Cong eventually just overwhelmed the South Vietnamese.
But despite being highly maneuverable, the Scout missions were vulnerable to attack.
I mean, very often these guys would crash. I mean, they get shot up, but it was beautifully designed. I mean, it's a little Easter egg with an A-frame on it, and the engine is protected within that A-frame. The blades would break off because they're lightweight, and the tail would break off, and this thing is just an Easter egg. It would roll up.
And it was only the design of the Loach that made them survivable. A lot of them were repairable and went back into service again.
These guys were crazy. Yeah, flying the Scouts, they were. Sometimes these guys would crash 2 and 3 times a week. At the Officers Club, we'd talk about that, you know. Yeah.
The Vietnam conflict was brutal and unforgiving. When the North Vietnamese mobilized to strike, American casualties were heavy.
We got our hat handed to us in the A Shaw Valley. Okay, that's right down by the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And then the A Shaw Valley was the area that the North Vietnamese pretty much owned. My friends that got overrun in Firebase Brick, it was these guys coming out of the A Shaw Valley. You're getting into my territory now where I have division-sized strength. And so they'll probe you, and once they find you, they will attack you and overrun you.
The North Vietnamese ground troops wielded a lethal weapon against the helicopters.
They actually had radar-controlled 50 cals. That'll take down a helicopter in a heartbeat.
Combating threats from ground forces in Vietnam led to the next generation of American attack helicopters. The Apache AH-64. Introduced in 1986, it served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Equipped to take out both armor and infantry, the Apache AH-64 is loaded with helicopter-launched fire-and-forget missiles, or Hellfire for short.
The main purpose of the Apache, our role primarily was initially designed, for destruction of tanks and vehicles, etc.
The Apache's role also provides air cover for ground troops. In military parlance, it's known as close air support.
In a lot of recent combat, we're there to support ground forces. In the overwatch role, when the troops are in contact, we're able to neutralize the enemy on different target objectives. We're equipped with 3 different main munitions. Our primary weapon is the Hellfire, and normally we use the 30mm.
The Apache is one of those aircraft that really is an iconic attack aircraft.
When first introduced into service, one of the Apache's revolutionary features was its helmet-mounted display. An integrated helmet and display mounting system. It was new technology that gave the pilot all the information he needed to target the enemy on his visor.
The gun can be slaved to the helmet of the crew, so wherever the crew look, that's where the gun can look.
The Apache's crew has an array of weapons they can choose to deploy. In addition to the 30mm chain gun, the Apache carries Hellfire anti-tank missiles and rockets. An 18-aircraft Apache battalion is able to deploy 288 Hellfire missiles, each capable of destroying a tank.
We're there to support ground forces. In the overwatch role, when the troops are in contact, we're able to neutralize the enemy. Our primary weapon is the Hellfire, and normally we use the 30mm to accomplish these tasks. If you look at the aircraft behind me, it has been places. It is dirty, it has a rough paint job, it has holes in it, so it's a fighting machine.
From the very beginning, the Apache was designed to perform in hostile environments and to operate either night or day and during adverse weather conditions. From the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan and the Balkans, the Apache is an all-terrain attack helicopter.
The Apache came into its own in both the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts.
Those Alpha models were able to cross from Saudi Arabia into Iraq to destroy radar sites in order to allow the Air Force to go ahead and conduct its strikes deep within Iraq. The Alpha model evolved into the Delta model. The Delta model has the longbow radar, so it took the 80s technologies and brought it into the 90s and into the early 2000s.
The Apache Delta model is equipped with the powerful longbow radar targeting system that can attack armored carriers, tanks, and infantry.
It can also detect around 128 targets on the ground in a minute and classify all of those targets.
The Apache is able to strike up to 5 miles away. It's also equipped with the Ground Fire Acquisition System, which detects and targets ground-based weapons in all light conditions, and has a thermographic camera that precisely locates muzzle flashes from gunfire.
The main strengths of the Apache are the amount of firepower it brings to the battle.
It just has the firepower to defeat virtually anything that's on the ground. Really, it's just the tank of the air.
In 1982, a decade before the Apache was introduced, British attack helicopters went into combat when Britain declared war on Argentina to retain sovereignty of the Falklands, a small group of islands located in the South Atlantic.
Britain assembled a task force in pretty much every available ship. Those were sent down along with an air component which included helicopters, so Chinooks, Wessex helicopters, Sea Kings, Sea Wasps, and basically those were the kind of mobility force along with the Marines.
The Falklands War was the first time the Wessex flew in combat. The helicopter's primary mission was to hunt down enemy submarines. April the 25th, 1982. An Argentine sub, the Santa Fe, was en route to South Georgia, a small island almost 1,000 miles east of the Falkland Islands. And the Wessex 3, or the Humphrey, was on the prowl, submarine hunting.
So Humphrey carried out a surface search and spotted on the surface this submarine coming out. He went straight in and carried out a depth charge attack.
And that seems to have caused sufficient damage to prevent it from immediately being able to dive.
Once the submarine had been spotted, other helicopters joined the Wessex 3 to press home the attack. The strike on the Santa Fe submarine caused it to surface near Cumberland Bay on the northern coast of South Georgia. Tony Ellerbeck was piloting a Wasp toward the attack. By his side was his gunner, David Wells.
The Wasp was a very important part of the Falklands War.
The Wasp was a small helicopter powered by a gas turbine. It was armed with 2 homing missiles.
Out we went. There was the submarine on the surface. I said, your target is submarine on the surface. 3, 2, 1, fire. It was a hit straight away. That was the first time. It was also the first time that a guided missile had ever been fired in anger by the Royal Navy, and it went from a Wasp.
But the Wasp merely stung the submarine. The vessel was back on the move, looking for shelter in Cumberland Bay. The Wasp needed to rearm. Ellerbeck returned to his aircraft carrier to reload. Meanwhile, other Wasps from the British frigate HMS Plymouth began to swarm around the submarine.
One of them dropped a Mark 46 torpedo in the water to run under and hit the submarine.
In the confusion, the runaway torpedo missed its target. As the Argentine submarine slipped away, the torpedo found a new target: a British submarine.
And that evening, there was a signal from the nuclear submarine that was sitting outside saying, "Thank you for the Mark 46 torpedo." They had had quite a few nerves jangling on that occasion.
Down but not out, the Santa Fe submarine was still seaworthy and still on the move. It evaded its British attackers. Ellerbeck and his gunner David Wells were given new orders to attack a land-based target.
So we decided that we would take out the Radio Shack. So I said, David, target is the Radio Shack, port missile, 3, 2, 1, fire. Nothing. Anyway, he fired the starboard missile, away it went. By that time, it was a bit of a hornet's nest. David said, I can see it, I can see it. And I thought he was still going for the Radio Shack when our missile started to climb and then turned and dived. What he'd actually seen was the submarine sitting alongside. He drove it straight into the back of the submarine, and the next thing, there were plates going through the air.
Tony Ellerbeck and his gunner David Wells had successfully captured the Santa Fe. The attack had taken just 2.5 hours. But as the day of the Argentine surrender drew closer, danger was ever present. A Westland Sea King helicopter was caught out in the open by Argentinian A4 Skyhawks.
We'd just been dropping some ammunition to the guns that were pounding the enemy positions around Stanley. As we turned to go back to collect another load, my crewman fortunately spotted 2 pairs of A4s, Argentinian ones, and they were clearly had seen us as well.
The Sea King was a beast of an aircraft. Measuring over 22 meters long and 5 meters high, it was an easy target.
The Sea King is not really very agile, and so it's basically operated from large decks, so aircraft carriers is its natural home.
But Simon Thornwill's Sea King was a long way from the protection of its aircraft carrier. The 4 Argentine Skyhawks zeroed in on the lone helicopter.
With one aircraft, a helicopter will normally get away from it. 2 fixed-wing aircraft and your odds are getting pretty dicey, but 4 aircraft and you're dead.
Simon Thornwill tried every trick in the book to dodge his attackers.
We were very close to some very rough terrain. In fact, it's called Impassable Valley. The element of fighter evasion is to normally dive and turn. Basically, the fighter aircraft is trying to track onto you, and if he's diving towards the ground and rough ground at high speed, it's very disorientating and difficult for him to get a good tracking solution.
By this time, Thornwill's Sea King was dangerously close to the ground.
My manoeuvring ability was actually quite difficult.
The remaining Skyhawk fighters were still targeting the Sea King.
But anyhow, he shot at us 20 seconds worth of 20 mil ammunition, which was his full amount. The last thing that I knew was a slight vibration, so I thought we might have been hit.
The Argentine Skyhawks broke off their attack, unable to follow the Sea King. Simon Thornwell had successfully evaded his attackers. But as Thornwell set down, he was in for a surprise.
That's when we found a hole in one of the rotor blades. The shell, which was a cannon shell, had gone through the blade before it had armed. The aircraft was so close to us that it hadn't armed. If it had armed before it hit the blade, I wouldn't be talking to you now.
The helicopter has redefined the modern battle space. Just like the cavalry, it rides into the fight, armed and able to suppress ground forces, fly in artillery and armour, and land troops behind enemy lines. The whirring blades that signal the approach of a helicopter both comforts its ground troops and strikes fear into the heart of the enemy.